In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light, he only came as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was not in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. The word of the Lord.
You can have a seat. I want you to imagine that you're in a really rough season of life. And it's just dragging on like it's never going to end. And then something happens, and it's just the straw to break the camel's back. It's the loss of a job, or the loss of a loved one, or a relationship falls apart. One more piece of disappointment, and you just cannot process it anymore. And so you go out, and you have about 7 too many. And then with your judgment impaired and your filters down, you go home with someone that you hardly know, and you do things that are completely out of character for you, things that you thought you'd never do. And you wake up in the middle of the night, tangled up in the sheets of a stranger, in a bed you've never been in a house you've never been in, and there's vomit streaked down your chin, and it's on the floor next to you, and in a sober moment, you come to your senses and just think, I gotta get out of here. And so you peel yourself out of that bed and you head for home in the early hours of the morning, smelling like vomit, with your head pounding, weighed down by shame, trying to piece together what you can remember of the night before. Finally, you make it to your front door and you reach into your pocket for your keys and, oh no, you don't have your keys. Now I want you to hang on that moment. I want to return to it, but I want to return to it with a lot more context. The Word became flesh. We've spent the last month working our way through John chapter 1. We have walked the paces of the Creator is the Recreator, of glorious promises grounded in reality, of children reborn into a divine family. And all of that has been building up to this phrase, the Word became flesh. That's more than just the punchline to John's gripping introduction. It is the hinge that the entire book turns on. Because up to this point, it's been very poetic and abstract. The word, or the logos in ancient Greek, it's been cosmic. In the beginning was the logos, but here, with the Word became flesh, John leaves behind the term logos and picks up the term Jesus for the remainder of his gospel. He never repeats that terminology again. Here, with this single phrase, what has been cosmic suddenly becomes and remains personal. And so for today, the plan is actually quite simple. We're going to make our way through a single verse, word by word, to meet the cosmic made personal, Jesus. So, let's begin. You ready? Yeah. All right, things have felt a touch sleepy. I'm going to need more from you than what you've been giving so far. I just want to acknowledge that up front. I'm a little bit sleepy myself. I was at the Lloyd Center ice rink last night with my children. You might have seen me doing the backwards skate next to the Christmas tree at some point. I'm just kidding. I can't do the backwards skate. All right. The Word became flesh. As refined as John has been up to this point in describing God's divinity, he is equally blunt here in describing his humanity. Ancient Greek has 2 different words for the one English word flesh. There's soma and sarx. Soma is a good and positive word for the human body. It is attractive, strong, noble. Sarx is a negative reference to the human body. It's a way of admitting that the same body that can be attractive, strong, and noble also gets sick, grows weak, one day will die, and eventually decays. So in describing God in the flesh, John quite intentionally chooses the second word. The Word became sarx. a body, and one with cravings and bowels and bad breath and BO. A body, and not a particularly attractive one either, not the airbrushed figure of a magazine, but the real kind, the common kind, the sarx kind. In Latin, it's caro, which gives us the English word carnal and the Spanish carne, as in chili con carne. See, John doesn't say the Word became a man or even the Word took on a body. That would have been clear, but it also would have been polite. He chooses the expression that would put it most bluntly. For 13 verses, he's been talking like a poet. Now he's suddenly talking like a sailor. The God big enough to create the cosmic expanse so wide and deep that scientific research indicates that all we've ever understood of the universe is just packed into a tiny little pocket. That God became a lump of meat. It's honestly difficult to overstate how shocking this statement would have been when John first put it on paper. John is a Jew who grew up with a view of God so reverent that they did not even dare utter his name. And that God, Yahweh, became flesh. Can you imagine John's gospel first being read in the reverent Jewish temple? Priests in long flowing gowns shooting disturbed glances at one another, a few people squirming with discomfort in the pews. John's gospel is unique because he's writing to both Jews and Greeks. Greeks who commonly believed that leaving the body through spiritual enlightenment was the destination of spirituality. And to them, he writes, the apex of spirituality is a God who came into a body. Can you see that read eloquently among the Greek philosophers around the Parthenon? Scoffing dismissively at this kind of idea. I thought you said we were here to consider some new teaching. Who wrote this? In those 4 words, John has managed to alienate the entire Mediterranean world, and he has done so to include the entire Mediterranean world. Just take a look with me back at your Bibles at the very next verse. John, that's in reference to John the Baptist, not John the author. John testified concerning him. He cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.'" Sounds like a riddle, doesn't it? He was before me and after me. Here's what he's trying to say. The Creator has entered my family line. And what John the Baptist said in a riddle and John the Apostle said in a poem, Matthew, the gospel writer, said in a genealogy. Here is the catchy intro that the gospel author Matthew went with. I want to read you the opening words of the New Testament. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. That's just the first 2 verses. It goes on and on and on like this for quite a while. Matt, get an editor, my man. You are losing us in the opening paragraph. You are burying the lead. It's actually a masterful intro because names are what set the biblical story apart from history's other great religions. See, when God breaks the silence between creator and creation, he does not begin with an explanation. He starts with a name, Adam. And Eve follows shortly after that. And God's first task for Adam was naming all the other creatures. Then God recreates in the same way that he created at first. After the whole forbidden fruit disaster, the swell of redemption begins with a name. Abraham, and later Sarah, and then Isaac. See, every story that captures our attention has names. A nameless story is limited in how much it can enliven the human heart because it doesn't get personal enough. Names are the most personal form of speech we've got in the human lexicon. Names take on so much more meaning than any other group of syllables ever could. Names take information and make it personal and participatory. I've got 4 photos that hang on my office wall. Every one of those photos represents a different prayer for me, a prayer that I pray every day. This is one of those photos. This is Walter McMillan. Walter was held on death row in Alabama for 6 years. And then he was released in 1993 after it was discovered that he had been locked away all that time for a crime that he did not commit. His lawyer was Brian Stevenson, and Walter later became the primary subject of the book and then the film, Just Mercy. Now, Stevenson is one of many lawyers who are combating and writing about the crisis of mass incarceration in the U.S., where currently, as of today, 6 to 10 times more people are imprisoned than in other industrialized nations, most of whom are our black and brown brothers and sisters. There have been a number of books written on that very important topic. So what on earth was it that set Just Mercy apart? What made it so much more popular than all the others? Well, it was that when Bryan Stevenson told the story of mass incarceration, he certainly included all of the facts and the figures and the statistics. He spoke clearly of the crisis. But when he told the story of this national injustice, it sounded like this: Henry, Charlie, Herbert, Walter. He told the story through names, in the most personal and participatory form of language. Now, I wish that I knew those names for different circumstances, but here's why Walter's picture hangs on my wall. It's to remind me that if it's Jesus I'm following, my story will be told the same way, through names. Because God tells his story along relational lines. Now, don't get me wrong, God is righting wrongs. God is healing the sick, and he's breaking the chains of injustice. He's opening up the gates of salvation. But the way he tells that story sounds like this: Joshua, Ruth, Deborah, Esther, Malachi, Jesus. And then when the word becomes flesh and lives among us, he goes around redeeming the world this way: Mary, Joseph, Simeon, Anna, later Peter, James, Mary Magdalene, Bartimaeus, Jairus. I could keep on going, but you get it. And if it's Jesus that I'm following, my story will be told that way too. Not through accomplishments or facts and figures, but through names and faces and stories. The Bible is littered with genealogies. It is covered with long lists of names. There's 10 of them in Genesis alone. There's 25 in the whole Bible. 2 of the 4 gospel authors, when writing a biography of the life of Jesus, include a genealogy in the opening movements of the story. Now, I chose not to open this particular sermon with the name of my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather because we live at a time and place that doesn't place a high value on generational lineage. So you don't really care that much about my family tree. But in the first century, family was everything. Family was perception, status, and opportunity. It all hung on your family name. 2,000 years ago, people treated genealogies a lot more like we treat a LinkedIn page today. They were selectively honest, right? You leave out the unflattering details of your employment history. They left out their great uncle who's locked away for life for trying to lead a political revolt. Jesus' genealogy, the very part of the gospel that make our eyes glaze over today, widened the eyes of the original readers. And that's because Jesus' family tree was jaw-dropping in that it included Gentiles, women, and sinners. There are Gentiles, there are non-Jewish names peppered throughout Matthew's genealogy. And if you know anything about Jewish history, you know that Gentiles were thought of more as animals than they were of people. They were widely considered unclean. And if a Jew was contaminated by incidental contact with a Gentile, they went through a series of cleansing rituals just to re-enter the temple. In fact, the temple itself only allowed Gentiles in the outer courts out of fear that they would contaminate the sacred building with their filthy presence. And Jesus has it on record that the family of God includes Gentiles. And then there's women, to which you're thinking, of course there is. Women give birth to literally everyone. You're going to need them for a family tree. But at the time of this writing, only the patriarch was named in genealogical lineage. Women were sadly treated as second-class citizens and excluded from written historical record altogether. No genealogy in history has ever sounded like Jesus's does. But here's the biggest surprise: sinners. Anyone manufacturing a case for their own divinity would never include the sort of moral disasters that Jesus writes into his own history. There's Tamar, who is most well known for disguising herself as a prostitute and seducing her brother. And that out of an incestuous, prostituted pregnancy, Jesus claims his heritage. There's Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute in Jericho. She believes, and by a stunning act of grace, she's written into the story of redemption in the line of the Messiah. Ruth was an outsider who didn't belong to God's covenant people. She got a vision for belonging, and now everyone who reads the story of the life of God on earth will know who she is and know that she belongs. And then there's Bathsheba. Bathsheba, who's historically stands for King David's worst moment, adultery, potentially rape, depending on how you weigh the evidence, and murder. And on page 1, paragraph 1 of God's arrival, the darkest spot of Israel's favorite hero is listed, and the victim of sexual coercion and abuse is redeemed. You see, Jesus writes incestuous prostitutes, adulterers, and murderers into his arrival to say, I have not come to whitewash your worst moments. I've come to graciously redeem every last part of you. Everyone who thinks they're on the outside looking in, I'm claiming you as my very own. The conditions that Jesus personally identifies with in the way he comes into the flesh include family dysfunction, sexual misappropriation, addiction, abuse, anger, anxiety, loneliness, marginalization, oppression, shame, manipulation, unhealed wounds, and quiet desperation, just to name a few. And if you can find yourself somewhere on that list, you can find yourself somewhere in the family of God. The family that Jesus came from tells us everything we need to know about the family Jesus came for. And it's a family that includes everyone, especially those who think they're excluded. He's powerful enough to create a new family line right within your current one, but he's also loving enough not to force that on you. And so Jesus was rejected by the insecure who couldn't conceive of a God who would love them enough to take on all of their dysfunction and redeem it. But he was also rejected by the proud who were convinced themselves that they could get everything Jesus offered on their own without the help of some peasant rabbi. Thank you very much. But he was welcomed by the humble and the tired and the weak and the weary and the hungry. He was welcomed by the honest. So if you can find yourself somewhere in that mess, you can find yourself somewhere in the family of God. Yet to all who did receive him, writes John, he gave the right to become children of God. Children of God. Children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. So what exactly does it mean to be born of God? Well, it means that the pain, dysfunction, and suffering that you've been an innocent victim of is promised to be bent by the great storyteller toward redemption. It means that everything you've ever done or will do can be forgiven. It means that you are filled with the actual Spirit of God, that the very power and presence of resurrection has now come to dwell in you. It means that you become the process of being made new across every category of your life. And it means that one day that you will live in a redeemed family without anger, betrayal, or disappointment, and all that will take place in a redeemed creation where there's no more sickness, mourning, death, or pain. So yeah, the ball is completely in your court on how you respond to that, but you are invited. And you're not invited in some, oh, come, everyone's welcome, whoever shows up, that's great sort of sense. You are personally sought out and personally invited to enter into this family and this story. The Word became flesh. That means at least this. It means the Creator entered my family line so that I could enter his. But that's not all it means. That's not even close to all it means. And we're just getting started here. So let's keep on reading. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now this word dwelling in our English translations, it's the Greek skenoo, which is most literally translated tabernacle. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. It connects the birth of Jesus back to the story of the Exodus, the high point of Hebrew history, the grounding story of the highest of all of the high holidays. Exodus chapter 40 spoke of the tabernacle, saying, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." John chapter 1 says, "The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory." Do you see the dots he's connecting? He's spelling this out as clearly as he possibly can. Glory has come again, only this time in disguise. The Hebrew word for glory is kavod, and you'll find that peppered all over the Old Testament. It's a one-word summary for the weight and authority and greatness and power of God. And there's a moment in Exodus 33 where Moses asked God to see his glory, to see his kavod, but the request was denied. You cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live, says Exodus 33:20. God was delivering a startling message. No one can see my glory without dropping dead on the spot. My face is holy enough to stop the human heart. But he does offer a consolation. But here, Moses, peek at my shoulder blade. It's all you can handle. Friedland Steer says, this is the apex, the ultimate, the extreme allowed to any theology, any philosophy, and any scholarship, the back of God, provided that we really desire to see his face. In The Magician's Nephew, which is the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis gives the vision of God, a picture of the vision of God that was left behind us by Moses. Diggory, the protagonist, catches a glimpse of Aslan. That's Lewis's depiction of Jesus walking past him, right in front of him. And part of him wants to reach out and touch the lion's mane, but there's another part of him that's afraid to. There's a part of him that wants Aslan to turn and look him right in the face, but there's another part that's terrified that he would. You see, in the time of Moses, God is present and powerful. He is obviously for us and among us, but God is not intimate. There are limitations to his knowability. And if you were to meet eyes with him, it would stop your heart. But still, knowing the risk, there's something in you that wishes that he would lock eyes with you. And as the Old Testament builds and builds like a wave in the ocean nearing the shore, the name Kavod Yahweh is used again and again to refer to God. It's referring to God's holiness, his otherness, his incomprehensible magnitude, that kind of reverence. That's the Jewish audience that John is writing to in his gospel when he says, and we have seen his glory. The glory of the one and only Son. The glory that would have killed Moses on the spot, I've seen it. And you have too. That's what John just said. Jesus. That's who John's talking about. The kavod. The glory that guided Israel like a cloud through the desert and through the middle of a sea and on into the promised land. The glory that descended on a mountain that was so powerful and holy that even to set foot on a mountain would take your life. The glory that filled the tabernacle so thick that not even the priest could walk into the building without falling face down. The glory that Moses wanted to see but couldn't see it and keep the breath in his lungs. That glory is no longer in a cloud or a building. It's in the flesh of a peasant infant who's been born in a rural barn from backcountry Nazareth. You see, that means that glory has become personal and knowable. The voice that spoke creation into being, I've heard it. The one that Moses said you couldn't look at, I've seen him. The unapproachable, I've touched him. The kavod, I know his name, and he knows mine. Glory is not in the tabernacle anymore, it's in his flesh. His sarx. It's that scandalous. William Barclay writes, this is possibly the greatest single verse in the New Testament, and certainly the sentence for which John wrote his gospel. Pete Greig gives it a 2-word summary, dirty glory. I like that. The untouchable, indescribable kavod got dirt in the creases of his hands. He rubbed dirt in the eyes of a blind man so that he could receive his sight. He scribbled in the dirt in front of an adulterous woman in order to grant her forgiveness. He scrubbed dirt from between the toes of his disciples as they finished dessert. It wasn't just physical, though. The people that they branded as dirty, he touched them too. He kept the company of the leper. He befriended the prostitute. He shared a table with the corrupt tax collector. No one can see the face of God and live. That's what Moses told them. And in a way, he was right. Everyone who saw the glory made personal, made knowable in Jesus, they fell to their knees, utterly undone, completely surrendered to him. That face, the one with a crooked nose and bags under his tired eyes and beads of sweat on his forehead, that's the face Moses told you would kill you. The kavod enfleshed. Jesus, dirty glory. A few verses later, John drives the point home. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. See, he's going to come again, and this time without a disguise. He'll come like glory in plain view. The end of the story is already written, but first, glory became one of us so that we might become like him. Take on the divine nature, it says in 2 Peter. The Word became flesh. That also means this, that glory got dirty so that I might become glory. But there's still more than that. And we still haven't reached the end of the claim. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. We've seen his glory, and that glory looked like grace and truth. Now, grace, that is one of the most familiar biblical words, and John uses it surprisingly sparingly and very intentionally. One scholar says that the most direct translation for grace in the Gospel of John is that which causes joy. Jesus has come to bring joy. He later himself said, I've come that you may have life and have it to the full. Now that implies two things. The first is that life on my terms is something less than that which causes joy. It secondly means this, that Jesus' aim is not to restrain me or control me, but to set me free. Then there's truth, the second word. That's a word that's fallen out of fashion these days. The only truth that we can agree on culturally today is that there is no such thing as objective truth, only subjective truth, only my truth and your truth. But when you or I say truth, we're usually referring to a verifiable set of facts, right? And that is one definition of the word truth. But there's another definition, an even more ancient definition that goes something like this. If I were to shoot an arrow, and that arrow flew through the sky and it went straight exactly where I had aimed it, you might say that's a true arrow. Meaning there isn't a small bend in the wood that causes it to curve as it flies in some direction that I haven't sent it. It flies straight. And so there's a definition of truth that has to do with verifiable facts, and there's another more ancient definition of truth that has to do with direction, that has to do with a straight path. This is true because it goes directly where it promises to go. So when John puts grace and truth together here, he's saying something like, we've seen his glory and it's a straight way that produces joy. I climbed the ladder at this company. I put in the long hours and I lost sleep over my boss's perception of me, and I stepped on the head of a coworker or two along the way, all because I thought that when I got this title or started my own practice or had this salary or seat at this table, it would produce joy. Did it? I obsessed over this relationship. I settled for someone who made me feel good because I got tired of waiting on someone who made me feel great. And I let him treat me okay, and I overlooked a few things and even said yes when he dropped to a knee because I thought that a house and a kids and a stable income would produce joy. Did it? I lived like there was no tomorrow. I started going out and staying up late and dabbling in substances that I used to avoid and living without regrets, all because I thought a full, free life was one unbound and more adventurous than the one I'd been living before. So I held on to my convictions, but I started living a way that I thought would make me feel free. Did it? Is the story you're living as you sit here today a true story? Is it taking you where it promises to go? Is it a straight path? Because we're all after joy. We're all trying to get to the same destination. We're just all using different maps. And most of our maps are not full of grace and truth. The way that produces joy is not a set of directions or an enlightened state. It's a person. It is to know and live in relationship with the Word that became flesh, Jesus. Elsewhere, he's called Emmanuel, a title meaning God with us. But how exactly is God with us? Well, Hebrews chapter 4 says he's with us this way. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who's been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So the Word became flesh so that he could share our experience, clothe himself in our pain, feel my shame, stare down my demons, and identify with the incomplete hand I've been dealt. And in Jesus, we've got a God who can empathize with our weaknesses. Now, this English word empathize, it's a combination of two Greek words. First, pasco, which means to suffer, and then the prefix with, kind of like we use the prefix co in English. The literal translation is not empathize, but co-suffer. That's how he deals with our brokenness. With the pain that we've inflicted on others and the pain that we have been an innocent victim of, he suffers with us. See, this is a God so big and mighty that cosmic poetry is the only way to try to describe him, and it's also the God of suffering who is so humble that shocking bluntness is the only way to describe him. Why? Because we've got a God who empathizes. Emmanuel. There are wires crossed in our human brains that want to convince us, and we insistently assume that we're closest to God whenever things are going well. Right? Jesus is by my side. He's present and helping when I'm living wisely and virtuously, when I'm keeping in step with his mission here in the world. That's when we feel closest to him. But Emmanuel means the opposite. It means that Jesus is near to us in our weaknesses as well as our strengths. Our hearts corrupted by sin are like magnets that push grace away, that are ever resistant to the ethic of grace that he's brought into the world. But Jesus' heart, which is uncorrupted by sin, works exactly the opposite way. He is magnetically pulled to our weaknesses, to our failure, to our weaknesses, our moments of greatest need. The psychologist David Benner writes this: everything within us tells us that the universe must be organized according to some principle wherein we get what we deserve. But quite unbelievably, God is not simply the projection of our own image on the cosmos. He is different from anything we could have ever imagined. He offers us something we could never deserve: forgiveness of our sins and the embrace of his love. See, empathy warms the human heart, but empathy doesn't heal. We need more than just an empathetic God, but we need a God whose power flows through empathy. And that's why the letter of Hebrews goes on to say this in chapter 7. Therefore, he is able to save completely those who come to God through him. Now, this word completely is used only one other place in the whole of the Bible, and it's in Luke chapter 13 when Jesus heals a woman completely. There's a woman whose back has been bent over for 18 years, and Jesus heals her completely so that she can be restored completely. What that means is that Emmanuel means Jesus doesn't just make a way for you and I to hobble through life and then make it to the end in one piece. He makes a way for us to stand up straight, run, jump, dance, and then laugh in the face of death. See, Jesus is a healer, yes, but he's a certain kind of healer. He is a doctor who has dealt with the very disease you're dealing with. He's a doctor treating your lung cancer who's also had lung cancer, so that he can empathize, so that he knows the effects that has on you, so that when he looks in your eyes and he talks to you about all that you're going through, it's something that he himself has gone through. Don't you see the difference in that kind of healer? Can't you feel the difference in sitting in that doctor's office as opposed to the one who's just dishing out prescriptions? See, here is glory. It's a God powerful enough to end suffering and loving enough to co-suffer. And the cross that he hung on, gasping for dying breath, that's what Jesus called his glory. Now is the time for my glory to be revealed. That's how he spoke of the cross. Jesus chose death. He held back his infinite power, and he took our curse on himself. 2 Corinthians 5 says it like this: God made him to be, who had no sin, to be sin for us. Jesus was crucified and buried in a tomb. He wore our curse all the way to the ground. Glory does not get dirtier than that. The glory of God laid in the dirt, but dirt could not hold him for long. 3 days later, Jesus rose. He's empathetic enough to suffer, and he's powerful enough to bring an end to all suffering and to restore all who come to him to full, free life. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the righteousness of God. The Word became flesh, and that means life came to die so that I could come alive. There's a story in John chapter 9 that I think sums up all this poetry really well. It's about a man who's been blind from birth, and so he's used to getting around in the dark. It's all he's ever known. But his problems run a whole lot deeper than blindness, because he lived at a time when any terminal disease was considered to be a curse from God, and so he was expelled from the temple because of his blindness. To be blind was to be cast out of the presence of God in the Hebrew community. It was to be excluded and ostracized. And that's why when Jesus' disciples ask him, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind, Jesus corrects the tragic misconception and heals the man of his blindness. But the way he does it is probably his strangest miracle. Jesus scoops up some dirt in his hands and spits in it, and then rubs it together and rubs it all over the man's eyes. And then through that, the man can see. What on earth is he doing? Well, in the Bible's opening chapter, all the way back in Genesis 1, God scoops up a pile of dust. He gets dirt in his hands, and he breathes life into it, and that's how he formed people. Human beings are distinct from everything else that God created in that he formed us out of the dirt and then filled our lungs with his breath. So why is Jesus spitting on dirt to heal a blind man's eyes? Well, this is just God up to his oldest trick again. He takes some dirt, puts his breath on it, and then makes something new. This is how he creates. He took a man whose life had been defined by the fallenness of this world, and then he redefined that man by the glory of God. Cue the very next scene. The blind man's in the temple, the place he's been banned from his whole life, and he's talking to the priest, the company he was excluded from until an hour ago. And they say, tell us who healed you. He claims to be God, but we know he's just a con man. And then we read this in John 9. We know this man is a sinner. That's the priest. The blind man replied, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, now I see. I don't know who he is to the whole world. All I know for sure right now is who he is to me, and that's healer. Jesus catches up with him again and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Lord, I believe. Jesus calls himself Son of Man. Glory, identified as dirty. And then the blind man calls him Lord. Glory of God. Jesus calls himself dust so that a blind man can see, and in response, that blind man calls him glory. You see, church, Advent builds and builds and builds through the dark until we finally get to this, that we believe in the God who painted the first sunset over the horizon, becoming a carnal piece of flesh. We believe in the voice that spoke creation into existence, speaking with a rural Middle Eastern accent. We believe in the God who fashions people out of dirt, learning to make tables and getting splinters in his hands. We believe in the name that is above every name, taking a common human name, the name at which one day every knee will bow, being humble enough to be mocked on the lips of some and Lord in the mouths of others. We believe in the omnipotent power held back beyond human comprehension, so that he would love the likes of us enough to take our fate, win our victory, and then offer it all to us as a free gift. We believe that God made himself out of the dirt as an act of love, returned to the dirt as an act of love, and then rose from the dirt as an act of love. We believe in the Word made flesh, in dirty glory, in Jesus. At his funeral, Eugene Peterson's son said that his dad used to pray the same prayer over him every night when he was growing up. And that prayer was always this: God loves you. God is on your side. He is coming after you. He is relentless. That's who he is. That's who he is. Do you know him? Now we're back where we started. I want you to imagine that you're in a really rough season of life, and it's just dragging on like it'll never end, and then something happens, and it's the straw that broke the camel's back. It's that one last disappointment you can't process anymore, so you go out and have 7 too many, and then with your judgment impaired and your filters down, you go home with someone and do things that you never thought you'd do, things that are totally out of character for you. Wake up in the middle of the night, and in a sober moment, come to your senses, peel yourself quietly out of a stranger's bed, head home in the early hours of the morning, smelling like vomit, head pounding, weighed down by shame, filled with regret, and you finally make it to your door, and you reach in your pocket for your keys, and oh no, you don't have your keys. You left them somewhere. Maybe it's at that stranger's house, maybe in one of the bars that you were at last night, but you're going to have to ring the doorbell and wake up your roommate or your spouse or your kids, and they're going to see you like this. And you're going to have to explain. You're going to have to relive something that you will spend months, maybe years, trying to forget and work through. And you're going to relive it in front of someone that you never wanted to know, never wanted to see you like this, or you never wanted them to see you like this. But you've got no other choice. So you just lay on that doorbell long enough to wake up everybody in the house. And then you hear someone creaking down the stairs, and you see the lights come on inside the house, and they walk down, and you can hear the deadbolt click open, and the doorknob turn, and the creak of the door pulls open, and then it's Jesus. What does Jesus do? How you answer that question will tell you everything you really believe about God. Doesn't matter what you say you believe. What does Jesus do? What does Jesus say in that moment? That's what you really believe. And if you take Jesus' word for it, here's what God would do. He would hug you. He would bring you in, vomit and all. And he would hold you long enough to let your tense body go limp and allow you to begin to weep. He would let you grieve all that you have held tightly inside the whole way home, because that's what the Father did for the prodigal son who wandered back onto his property filled with regret and shame. And then he'd put on a pot of coffee and make you breakfast, because that's what he did for Peter on the morning of his great shame on a beach somewhere outside of Galilee. And he'd sit with you and listen. He'd listen to you talk about last night or talk about something else, whatever you want to talk about, whatever you're ready to talk about, whatever, it's enough for him. Just to be with you in your moment of need. He's not trying to force anything. And then he'd look at you through eyes of pure grace and he'd ask, where does it hurt the most? And he'd reach out his hand to touch and to heal there, because that's what he did for a blind man whose obvious ailment was his sight, but whose deeper ailment was his exclusion and ostracization from community. And then he'd remind you that you're loved. That he loved you first, before you lived a single day or did a single thing to drum up your own lovableness. Before you became lovable in your eyes or in anyone else's, he loved you, and that he still loves you, that he still chooses you, that he still comes after you, and he will never tire, that he's relentless, and that you're family. Because that's what Jesus did when he claimed to be the good shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after the one who's lost and alone. And if you think Jesus shouldn't do all of that, you're right. He shouldn't. But if you think Jesus wouldn't do all of that, you're wrong. He would. And he does. So if you're here and you don't know Jesus, regardless of the vocabulary that you would have used to describe your belief or unbelief in the past, if the God that I just described is not the God that you know, then you should know that this is the God who would want to welcome you into his family today. That this is the God who broke into our world and will never stop trying to break into your world. And this is the God reaching out to offer you a free gift, no strings attached. God loves you. God is on your side. He is coming after you. He is relentless. That's who he is. Do you know him? Because I would just say this is too good to hold yourself together. It's too good to put off for another day. It's too good to resist. And if you're here and you do know this Jesus, then I would just say this is too good to stay on the page. It's too good to live through other people's experiences and stories. It's too good to merely reflect on during a certain time of year. It's good enough to experience, to encounter the glory of God in the person of Jesus again today. The Word became flesh. It's that personal. And it's still that personal.